Dispensationalism. And we should be down on page 15. We're going to be looking at the first dispensation after we've spent several weeks looking at really introductory thoughts concerning dispensationalism. Yes, middle of page 15. But before we jump into this first dispensation, let's review a little bit. We were talking the last couple of weeks on or answering what is a dispensation, and can someone, does anybody remember the definition that we gave for a dispensation? Yeah, Susan. Okay, so that's one way to look at what a dispensation is. It's dealing with a house rule or house rules in a particular time. Anybody recall another definition we gave? Eileen?
Was it stewardship?
Okay.
Management?
Yes, very good. Dispensation is a stewardship or a management. And we looked at Luke chapter 16 dealing with the steward there, the person who was managing the household of the owner. The same we saw in Genesis 39, Joseph being the steward of Potiphar's house. He was the manager. Potiphar put that management position into Joseph's hand. And he was responsible to carry out the house rules, right? And so the word dispensation, oikonomia, the literal definition is house rules. But as we saw, that word being translated steward in Luke chapter 16. So if you can remember, when it comes to dispensationalism or a dispensation, if we can keep it simple, think stewardship when you think of a dispensation. So what is a dispensation? What's that all about? Well, it's about a stewardship. And as we saw, there's not just one dispensation. There is not just one stewardship. God has given a stewardship to different people at different times. And in some cases, we're going to look at 7 dispensations, but we could go through Scripture and look at like individual stewardships, right? Where God gave a specific stewardship to one family, right, or to one individual. Now, we're not going to take the time to look at, we could say those secondary dispensations. We're going to be looking at these major dispensations in which God is working, not necessarily with an individual, although the dispensation of innocence we're going to see only was with 2 people. But for the most part, the dispensations are dealing with God's government of a people or the world for a specific period of time. All right, so with that, keeping that dispensation, the definition of a dispensation in mind, as we go through these dispensations and start with innocence this morning, we want to also remind ourselves of the three things to look for. We mentioned at the end of our study last week, the 3 things to look for in a dispensation. And what are those 3 things? Okay, responsibility. Right, that's what a stewardship is. Management, it's a responsibility that the steward is to carry out. So we need to look for, in every dispensation, we need to look for the stewardship. Look for the responsibilities that are given. What was the second thing? Okay, man's failure, the failure of the steward to carry out the specific responsibilities given to him or given to a nation. And what was the third? Okay, judgment, God's judgment. And so we're going to see that in every dispensation highlighted, the responsibility, the stewardship that is given, man's failure to carry out those responsibilities, man's failure to be faithful to those responsibilities, and then God's judgment is going to fall upon a people that he gave that stewardship to. And then another dispensation will be introduced. Okay, so let's look at the first one here on page 15 in your notes. The dispensation, or the stewardship of innocence. The dispensation of innocence. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2, and let's start with the stewardship itself. What responsibilities did God give to a people, and in this case to Adam and Eve, as they were the only human beings on the face of the earth during this particular dispensation, or this first dispensation. Genesis chapter 2, of course, chapter 1, God creates everything, including man. His creation is ended. In chapter 2 now, God is going to give the stewardship to Adam and to Eve. Chapter 2, someone like to read verses 15 through 17. Okay, so what was the stewardship or the responsibility that God gave to Adam in verse 15? Okay, to dress and to keep the garden. So those are the blanks to fill in. According to verse 15, Adam was responsible to dress and keep the garden. To dress and keep the garden. Now, what exactly that looked like, we're not sure, because there obviously wasn't weeds and thorns and thistles at this time. That didn't come until after God's judgment, as we'll see. But there would have been, with all of the trees, the fruit trees, etc., we assume that there would have been pruning that would have been needed. And maybe some tilling, cultivating of the garden, of the soil, perhaps was included. So there was certainly responsibility here to dress and to keep the garden, make it neat, and so that was their stewardship. That was Adam's, and then of course Eve, working with Adam, no doubt, in dressing and keeping the garden. Now, we mentioned in every dispensation in a stewardship there are privileges. Right? Whenever you're put in a management position, it's a privilege to be a manager, but with privilege comes responsibility. But there was a privilege for Adam and Eve being the steward or the managers of really the world at this time as they're placed in the garden. And what was the privilege that Adam and Eve had according to verse 16? Okay, eating, elaborate on that. Okay, eating what? Eating of every tree of the garden. Okay? Isn't that a privilege? So here are all kinds of different fruit trees, variety of fruit trees as we would have today. Many different fruit trees to partake of and to enjoy. Well, it was no different here. Of course, we know that they had herbs as well. They would have had various berry bushes to partake of. And God is telling Adam and Eve, here's your responsibility to dress and to keep the garden, and here's a privilege. You get to partake of all of these fruit trees, all of these berry bushes, all of these herbs that are growing. You get to partake of them. It wasn't that God said, here's all of these fruit trees and berry bushes and herbs, and there's only 3 of the fruit trees you can eat of, and 2 of the berry bushes and a couple of herbs. He says, no, this is all for you to enjoy. So they had a privilege. Now, there's another privilege that's not in your notes, but there's another privilege that they could enjoy, and that is found back in chapter 1 in verse 28. Genesis 1:28. Someone like to read that verse?
And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth.
Okay, so what's the privilege here that man had?
Dominion over the animals and multiplying.
Yeah, dominion over all animal life. They had power, if you would, authority given to them over all of God's creation, all of God's creatures that He had made. And notice also in middle of verse 28, there's really another privilege that is mentioned there, and that is in regards to the earth. What were they to do in regards to the earth, Susan? Subdue it. And that has the idea of Adam and Eve figuring out how the earth worked. In other words, it really has to do with technology. Figure out how God created the world and the different things that you can use, and subdue it. Figure it out, and getting into all kinds of this sort of got into various mathematics. This would have got into various chemical things, again, various technology things that they could figure out, just as people figure out today, being able to take water and separate the hydrogen from the oxygen, and various other things to be able to create things. Well, Adam and Eve had the privilege of doing that, had the privilege of being able to figure out the different things that God created to be able to make other things as a result. And so that's the idea of subduing it. So there's great privilege that Adam and Eve had as a manager, if you would, as a steward over God's creation. They had the privilege of enjoying the food, and they had the privilege of figuring out, using their mind and doing different experiments to figure out how God created different things and how they could use that to make other things. All right, going back to chapter 2, what was the responsibility according to verse 17? What was the responsibility given to them there? Okay, so we have the negative, or the command, or the thou shalt not, if you would, eat of the knowledge of good and evil. So one tree, only one tree that God had created that Adam and Eve were not permitted to partake of. But God is very generous to Adam and Eve in eating all the other trees of the garden. Bob?
Why do you think God would put that tree of good, knowledge of good and evil in the garden?
Yeah, apparently it was a way of testing Adam and Eve's obedience. Are they going to he's going to give Adam and Eve the opportunity to either obey or to disobey. So yes, I think it was ultimately to test them. Are they going to remain loyal to God? Are they going to obey him? Or are they going to disobey him? So he's going to give them a choice. If there was never an opportunity for Adam or Eve to rebel, then obviously, we wouldn't have had the sin entering into the world. But really, Adam and Eve wouldn't have then had a choice if there was never an opportunity for them to make a choice to either obey or disobey. And so God is going to, through creating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to test them. Susan?
Just thinking on that, without something that could be left out of the privilege, left out of the responsibility, I had it a minute ago, I can't say it right now. There really isn't obedience if there isn't a way to disobey. Otherwise, it's just everything's the same.
Yeah.
Everything just happens as it happens. There's no such thing as obedience.
Right. So if there was never an opportunity for them to disobey, then yeah, was there really then an opportunity for them to obey, because that was the only option? Kathy?
I think also the angels are learning about God through this, how he treats Adam and Eve and what happens to them and that kind of thing.
Sure. We know that throughout history, according to Ephesians chapter 3, angels are learning about the manifold wisdom of God. Today, they're learning about the manifold wisdom of God through the church age. But throughout these various dispensations, the angels are learning, how God is working with mankind and how he's working here with man. He's created Adam and Eve. And now he clearly, through creating the knowledge of good and evil, he has clearly created Adam and Eve with the ability to choose. He has given them a free will to choose to obey God or to choose to disobey God. And so the angels are certainly learning about how God has created man. He's created man with the freedom to obey or disobey. Yeah, Susan?
Thinking about the subduing part, and they're being given the opportunity to take what God has and make other things. That's what they did when they made the fig leaves.
Yeah. Yes.
An example of using their mind on what's here, what's available, what can I do with it.
Yes. And then, of course, later on, we read, even after the fall, we read about how early on in civilization, you have man using different metals to create certain things. So they're getting that from the earth. These various metals, gold, silver, iron, bronze, etc., to create instruments, to create weapons, to create different agricultural instruments. So that's part of subduing, figuring out what is in the earth, what materials God put there, so that we can extract them out and use them today. And we're still doing that today. In one sense, we're still subduing the earth in that we're still figuring out, well, what is in the earth, what materials are there, and what's in the atmosphere, and how we can, just think of like solar today. They've made these solar panels or different things that are made that are solar, that takes the energy from the sun, the sunlight, and as a result produces electricity. Or the same with a windmill, right? Using wind to create energy, or in the different things in the earth, drilling for oil. Man had to figure out, subdue, so to speak, well, what is in the earth, and how can we, there's oil in the earth, how can we extract that and use it for energy? So that's all part of subduing. And Adam, again, had the privilege of being able to figure all that out. Okay, so their responsibility was to dress and to keep the garden, and not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. According to verse 17, what was the consequence if Adam and Eve disobeyed? Okay, they would die. Or the Hebrew there rendering is dying, you will die. I mean, it gives the indication of a process of dying. So we know obviously God didn't, strike them dead when they took the fruit. Now there was really two deaths that occurred. There was the spiritual death. They were now separated from God. Sin now is going to separate them from God. But number two, they died physically in the sense of the rendering here. They began the process of dying. So that in Adam's case, 950 years later, he would die. So God never intended Adam and Eve to die. He created them to live forever. But now the sin has entered into the world. They have disobeyed. Now their bodies would begin to decay. Or as Paul would say later in 2 Corinthians 4, the outward man is perishing. It's a present tense verb. The outward man is perishing. It's continually declining, decaying, and many of us are feeling that, right? You reach a certain age, and right, your body, you feel it start to decline. It's not working as well as it did when you were 17 or when you were 25. Things aren't working as well. Well, that's part of the process of dying, and that's what Adam and Eve would have gone through after they sinned. Okay, so that was man's responsibility. That was their stewardship. Very simple, basic, wasn't complicated, very straightforward, relatively easy, so to speak, in that all they had to remember was, okay, we got to dress and keep the garden, and we're not allowed to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it wasn't something that would have been difficult to memorize, something to really focus on, because it wasn't like they had 100 different commandments given to them. They really had 2 commandments. Dress and keep the garden, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then God is gracious to let them know the consequence. If you do eat, if you do disobey, this is what's going to happen. So they knew ahead of time the consequence. So that's man's responsibility. That's man's stewardship. And Adam and Eve is responsible to be what to these responsibilities? What's the key word? Faithful. Remember 1 Corinthians 4:2. It is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. That's what God was looking for with Adam and Eve, being faithful to these 2 commandments. And now let's, unfortunately, look at man's failure to be faithful to the stewardship. Chapter 3, someone like to read verses 1 through 6.
Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the fields which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day that ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat.
Okay, so was man faithful or unfaithful to the stewardship that God gave them? Unfaithful. Man was unfaithful. In the commandments. Now, they may have been faithful in dressing and keeping the garden, but unfaithful in the commandment not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Man fails to live up to God's commandment. And so they fall into disobedience. They disobeyed the Lord. Both Adam and Eve disobeyed the Lord. And as a result of man's failure, God already told Adam and Eve what would happen, Genesis 2. If they disobeyed, if they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so now we're going to see that happened. They both began the process of dying, and there's going to be a list of consequences. But notice specifically the judgment of God in chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. Genesis 3, 22 to 24. Someone like to read that? Okay, so what was the judgment of God upon man according to these verses?
Was driven out of the garden.
Yeah. God drove both Adam and Eve out of the garden, and must have been what would have been the most beautiful garden anyone has ever seen today. And better. This is before the curse. So this was a garden God specifically made for Adam and Eve to enjoy, and now they're kicked out, if you would. They're not permitted to stay in the garden. And one of the reasons that God mentions that he had to kick them out is because there's the tree of life there. And apparently, had they stayed, or God allowed them to stay in, if at that point after they sinned, disobeyed, if they had partaken of the tree of life, then they would have lived forever in a fallen state, in a sin-fallen state, which God obviously did not want. So in that sense, God is being gracious to Adam and Eve because he didn't want them to live forever in a fallen state. And so in order to prevent that from happening, he drives them out of the garden and he places these cherubim at the entrance with flaming swords, and to keep them out of the garden. They were not permitted to go back in. So we have man's responsibility. Man fails to be faithful to those responsibilities. God brings judgment upon man, and in this case, by driving him out of the garden, not permitting him to go back in. And then we have, as a result of sin now, we have a list of consequences that man will have to deal with for the rest of time until the Lord returns to set up his kingdom. So these consequences are going to remain, and we see the effects today. We are still dealing with the consequences of Adam and Eve's disobedience. Let's look at them in chapter 3, verse number 16. Someone like to read that?
And so the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee.
Okay, so there's a couple of things mentioned here in light of the consequences of sin. So this is dealing specifically now with the woman, what the woman would have to deal with because of sin. And notice he says, your conception is going to multiply. So in other words, you're going to have children that aren't spaced out as God originally intended. In other words, you're going to get pregnant, if you would, more often. There's going to be, your conception is going to be multiplied, and so maybe originally, maybe it was God's intention that a woman would get pregnant, she would give birth to a child, and then maybe she wouldn't be able to get pregnant again for 10 more years before she had another one. But now her conception would multiply, children would come, potentially would come more often than what God originally intended. And the second thing that is mentioned is, in sorrow you would bring forth children. So again, apparently there would be a greater pain, greater sorrow in bringing forth children. So apparently prior to the fall, there was either no pain or it was very limited pain. So that has now greatly increased, so that women today have to go through great suffering, great pain to bring forth children. And the third thing is mentioned is your desire would be to your husband, and he will rule over thee. Now, the I think proper way to interpret that is to understand, because we have the same statement given in chapter 4 concerning Cain let's see, it's when he is not bringing the proper sacrifice, and God gives him another opportunity. See if I can find it real quick.
Verse 7, chapter 4.
Yes, thank you. So to Cain he says, if you do well, meaning if you bring the right sacrifice, thou shalt thou not be accepted. If thou doest not well, meaning you're going to refuse to bring the proper sacrifice, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire. In other words, unto thee shall sin be your desire. Sin is going to seek to rule over you. And thou shalt rule over him. So if you bring the right sacrifice, you're going to be able to rule over sin. If not, sin is going to desire to rule over you. And that's the concept in Genesis 3 concerning the woman. Your desire is going to be to your husband. In other words, because of sin now, your desire is going to be to rule over him. But it's God's structure, how he is set up in the home, is that the husband is the head of the home and he's going to rule over her. But now you're going to have a marriage conflict that wasn't there prior to the fall. Adam was still the head of his home prior to the fall, but it was no issue for Eve to let him rule, to be in subjection to him. But now that sin has entered into the world, now it's going to be a struggle for the woman to do that. Her desire is going to be to rule over him at times, even though he is still going to rule over her. There's still going to be the structure of the headship there, but now you're going to have consequences. You're going to potentially have marriage problems. There's going to be this marriage struggle of who's going to rule, the man or the woman. And so that's a consequence that the woman is going to have to deal with, that Eve had to deal with, and all of her descendants are going to have to deal with. How about verses 17 and 18? Someone like to read those verses? Okay, so what is the consequence now that man would have to deal with? Okay, yeah, he's going to have to work much harder than he did when he was in the garden. What's happened to the ground? Thorns and thistles, because God did what? God cursed it. So now man is going to have to deal with a cursed ground, which is going to make it harder to produce food, because you're going to deal with now the thorns and the thistles, and working to the sweat of your brow in verse 19. So prior to sin, keeping and dressing the garden was a delightful thing. You didn't have to deal with thorns and thistles. The ground wasn't cursed. Didn't have to do much for those fruit trees and berry bushes and herbs, etc., to produce. Now that God has cursed the ground, now it's going to be much more difficult. It's going to take much more effort to get those fruit trees to grow and to keep and dress the ground, because you're going to deal with a cursed ground. And of course, we're still dealing with that today. If you don't keep your garden weeded, you don't keep the thorns and thistles out, what happens? You can plant all your pepper plants and your tomatoes and squashes and corn and carrots and beans, etc., etc. You can have your garden full of these things, but if you don't keep and dress it, if you don't keep those thorns and thistles out, you don't weed it, what do you think is going to happen? The weeds take over every time, unless you keep those, go out there and weed those, weed out the thorns and thistles and weeds. The vegetables don't take over. The weeds take over. So we're still dealing with that today. Still dealing with that consequence. Let's go to the New Testament, book of Romans. Romans chapter 5, and Paul elaborates on this a little bit in Romans chapter 5, telling us why there's death. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Paul says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin." Why is there death? I'm sure there's a lot of people asking that question today who don't know and understand the Bible. They don't know and understand Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. Why is there death? Why do people have to die today? Well, Paul tells us here why. Because of Adam's sin. Now we have to face death. Death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. Romans 5:18 says, "Therefore, as by the offense of one, judgment came upon all men to condemnation." And verse 19, "For by one man's disobedience many were made sinners." Okay, so this is why there's death. This is why everyone is born a sinner, because of Adam and Eve's disobedience. So this first dispensation becomes very important. The dispensation of innocence, important to understand what happened, because we're able to answer, in understanding this dispensation, we're able to give people answers as to why there's death today, why we can answer why there are diseases today, why there's suffering today. Where did thorns and thistles, where did they come from? Well, Genesis 3 tells us they came as a result of the curse. Why is the ground cursed? Why are there earthquakes that happen? Well, because the ground has been cursed, and of course that deals as well with what happened in the global flood. But very important to understand these first chapters of Genesis, because it gives us answers as to why we're dealing with things to the present day, to this day. We're dealing with things that happened nearly 6,000 years ago. An event that happened nearly 6,000 years ago. We're facing, still facing the consequences today. And so we can point people, particularly the unbeliever, we can point to them why they have to die, why there's sin, why there's suffering, why there's thorns thorns and thistles, because of Genesis 3. And what a great opportunity then to lead right into the gospel presentation, when we can show individuals from the scripture why they have to deal with what they're dealing with today and people around them. Any questions, comments on the dispensation of innocence?
Just
Leslie?
clarity. When the Lord drove Adam out of the garden and pronounced a judgment upon him, does it mean that he in terms of space, he was out of that space that was called Eden altogether and go to an external space? And if that is so, the fact that the angel was placed at the gate to guard the tree of life, it means that Adam would not have access to the garden.
That's
So where would he get the fruit trees that we know today that he believed, is a part of the garden? Come from?
right. So obviously we have in Genesis 1, we have the creation account. So we have on, day 3, where we have plant life. So that would have been plant life all over the world, not just in the garden. So that would have been a separate location. So the garden would have been a separate location, geographically, land mass. Probably wasn't huge. I wouldn't assume that it was this massive garden, maybe the size of Texas or something. Maybe it was, but it was a certain location anyway. And when God, as part of his judgment, drove them out, he's driving them outside of that garden, where they never had access to it again. And it would have been destroyed in the global flood. So the Garden of Eden doesn't exist today because that would have been destroyed in the flood. So there would have been other trees, other fruit trees outside of the garden that God had created on again, day 3. And so these plants, fruit trees, berry bushes, herbs, etc., would have already been full grown, because when God created everything, he created it full grown. And so they would have then been able to take from those trees, the pits from the different fruit trees, and replant. But all of now his creation is cursed. And so immediately you're going to start having these weeds coming, the thorns and the thistles, which is now going to make life very difficult for man in gardening, etc. That the garden itself was a special thing that God had made for Adam and Eve. Does that help at all make any sense? Okay.
Just trying to provoke the thought, because when you go out there and talk with a person who has been indoctrinated about, creation, they look for those little loopholes, so to speak, and use it to strengthen their arguments.
And keep in mind that now you have you're going to have animal life all over the world as well. That's going to populate from the original 2, as Adam is naming them. So they were not just stationed in the garden. The animals are going to populate all over the world. But yes, the garden in itself would have been a location, which they believe was probably somewhere in the Middle East. But as far as the exact location, we're not sure. Even though we have in chapter 2, we have some of the rivers, and it mentions, I think, the Euphrates River is one of them. But we need to understand that in the global flood, the whole world was disrupted and destroyed. So the Euphrates River today, is that the exact location of the original Euphrates? We don't know, because everything would have been destroyed, and there was upheaval, and so it's not, we'd probably not know exactly the location of that area just because of the global flood. All right, we're out of time. We'll pick up next time on the next dispensation, as we'll see introduced for us after the fall of man. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for these dispensations. Help us as we continue our study to see the stewardship that is mentioned, the commandments that are given, that you required man to be faithful to obeying, and man's failure, and then your judgment. And so help us as we walk through these dispensations to better understand your working through different time periods in history. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.